Greetings from NAFSA 2018. This is NAFSA's Worldview with Moustafa Bayoumi. I'm Sharif Barsoum, Associate Vice President for the Office of Global Services at New York University. Moustafa Bayoumi is the author of the critically acclaimed How Does It Feel to Be a Problem? Being Young and Arab in America, which won an American Book Award and the Arab American Book Award for Nonfiction. Professor Bayoumi is also a columnist for The Guardian, and his writing has appeared in several high-profile news publications, including the New York Times Magazine, New York Magazine, and CNN. Professor Bayoumi is a professor of English at Brooklyn College, City University of New York, and is the recipient of 2 Excellence in Teaching Awards. It's a pleasure having you here today joining us at NAFSA, Professor Bayoumi. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
So our first question. Since the publication of How Does It Feel to Be a Problem? The lives of young Muslims in this country have become more complicated since the attacks of 9/11. How are young Muslims, especially those on your campus, responding to the rapid changes facing them today?
Well, you're right. There have been a lot of changes in the United States, especially since 9/11, and more recently, I could say, with the election of Donald Trump. That has made a hostile environment even more hostile, especially for young Muslim Americans.
Right.
And I think we've seen that on my campus. We've seen some fear from them. We've seen some anxiety. People don't know what they're facing. In fact, we have the travel ban, for example, looming, and that has implications across campuses across the country. But at the same time, we've also seen, I think, a lot of solidarity building. We've seen a lot of activity. We've seen a lot of activism. And not only on Muslim issues too. For example, many of the young Muslims on my campus were very engaged in the when Donald Trump wanted to withdraw DACA protections from some students who are here without proper documentation. We had a spontaneous walkout on my campus, and that was led by many of the activist students on campus, and many of them are Muslim students themselves. So I think that kind of solidarity building is actually very important for understanding the moment that we are in.
Excellent. It's interesting that you started writing your book, your first book, during the Bush administration. And it was published during the Obama administration. And then you're now celebrating 10th anniversary during the Trump administration. So how does these 3 vastly different administrations impacted young Muslims growing up here in the U.S.?
I think that what we need to pay attention to is less the differences between these 3 administrations, unfortunately, and more the continuities between them. I think what we'll discover is that there's more continuity than difference. There's been a lot of what I would call state repression that began with the Bush administration, when there were all kinds of initiatives that were aimed and targeted specifically at Muslim communities around the country, such as special registration, for example, which was a program that tried to forced males between the ages of 16 and 75 to register for their whereabouts with the country if they came from these majority Muslim countries. And then we have, with the Obama administration, we had in essence, we had a continuation of many of these similar sorts of policies, with things like countering violent extremism that really stigmatized Muslim communities. And then now we have it with the Trump administration. We have things such as the travel ban, for example. So, in fact, I think what we really do see is a lot of continuity rather than difference between them. The difference, I would say, with the Trump administration is that when Donald Trump was running for president, he, in fact, I think what he did was he spoke out loud an Islamophobia that was quietly in practice. And by doing so, what he did was he really instrumentalized Islamophobia sort of deeply into our own politics. So it became a platform by which you could run and win an election on, or at least it was an integral part of his election success. So I think that is different, and what it means is that there's more popular hostility now, not just coming from the state, not just coming from the government, but even also from segments of the population. And we can see that even in the data. What we find is that hate crimes, for example, have gone up significantly since Donald Trump entered the national scene as a politician.
Right, so it's more visual and you see it more.
Yes.
Absolutely. Another question. W.E. Du Bois wrote on the idea of double consciousness in regard to the African American experience here in the country. For those who are young and Muslim, growing up in America, seeing themselves through their eyes and also the eyes of others, and measuring their identity through each of these two lenses. Still a primary struggle, do you think? Or has it changed, especially with the onset of the Trump administration?
Sure, yeah. I think, that frankly, that any population that's outside of the mainstream lives a kind of double consciousness, because whenever you're in a minority position, you both see yourself as you understand yourself, but you also inevitably have to see yourself as how the dominant culture sees you. And Muslim Americans continue to be part of a minority population in the United States. So I think their notion of double consciousness remains. It continues. It still exists. In some ways, I would say that it's an important thing for them to acknowledge as well, because we have, for example, within the Trump administration, we have some rabid ideologues who have very specific anti-Muslim agendas, like Stephen Miller, for example, or John Bolton. So understanding how they're being seen by the government is even more important for Muslim Americans right now, because the government has a very specific ideological agenda. But at the same time, too, what that has meant is that a large part of American society, of the American population, now acknowledges that Islamophobia is a real social phenomenon. And I think that that's quite different. We didn't have that to the same degree, that recognition, in years past. So it's also important to understand the complexity of that. And it's very important because we need to understand where our allies are. Muslim Americans are about 1% of the American population. There's no way that 1% of the population can essentially change the minds of a large percentage of the population, of the American population. So we need allies to understand what kind of struggle we're facing. But not only that, I would also add one last thing, which is that, Islamophobia is harmful not just to Muslim Americans. It's harmful to all Americans. And really, to solve the problems, the sort of latent bigotry that lies behind a kind of anti-Muslim agenda, is to fight not just for the rights of Muslims, but really for the rights of all Americans.
Absolutely. I'm sure you've heard about the You Are Welcome Here campaign that was started by international educators as a way to show support for international students planning to work or study in the United States. Do you think a similar campaign is needed to support or encourage young Muslim Americans as they face their own struggles here in the United States?
Yeah, I think any oriented campaign along those lines could probably do some good. But I also think that it has to be carefully done. The fact is that a Muslim identity is an extraordinarily complex identity. Muslim Americans come from at least 77 different countries of origin, and Islamic Muslim history in the United States goes back all the way before the United States even existed. It goes back to the days of slavery, when large numbers of people who were enslaved in this country from Africa were Muslim in faith and belief. So we can't think of a Muslim identity as being a simple identity. We have to think of it as being a very, very complex identity. So that puts a lot of pressure, a lot of responsibility, I think, on teachers themselves, so that they don't just collapse Muslim identity into being one identity, but understand the complicated relationships that it has with people's own national identities, family identities, regional identities, all of these other identities as well.
It is complex, that's for sure. In a recent interview, you have said that in high schools that you've visited recently, school officials have told you that some of students have hid the fact that they are Muslim to avoid conflict. Do you see this as a growing trend or a phenomenon in high schools or colleges even?
Well, let me point you to, again, a survey that said that Muslim students suffer bullying at degrees that are 40% higher than the general population. It's not uncommon that even Muslim students will have teachers who will say really, Islamophobic things. Another survey says that about a third of young Muslim women or girls who are in school who wear hijab have either had it improperly touched or that people have tried to pull it off of them as well. We can remember the story of Ahmed Muhammad, the boy who was very proud of the clock he built at home, and then he brought it to school and then was arrested because they thought that he was bringing a bomb to school and these sorts of things. So, it can be a hostile environment for young Muslims at school. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if people would want to hide that fact from others.
Yeah. NAFSA 2018 is a global conference of international educators from over 100 countries. What role can international educators, especially those in the United States, take in helping young Muslim students overcome the challenges they face while also helping them reach their academic goals and career goals?
I think for a lot of young Muslims that I talk to, and many of them come to me when I'm either at my office, when I'm at work, or even when I'm on the road giving lectures, I talk to a lot of young Muslims, just as part of my daily life. And one of the interesting things that comes across is that many of them feel that Islamophobic acts or anti-Muslim sentiment that's directed towards them are not recognized as such by school administrators. And so I think that we need a greater education along school administrations to understand what constitutes something that's anti-Muslim and what the proper redress would be, as well as what kind of reasonable accommodations can be provided for Muslim students if they want to practice the faith, and how that could happen. But those are things that are specific to the Muslim students themselves. I also think that it's an important element of American education, if we're going to talk about American education for a moment, to think about the ways in which we talk about Islam in this country. Islam in this country didn't begin on September 12th of 2001. As I was just saying, there's a long history here. The history, for example, of Islam and Muslims who were part of the enslaved population in the United States is a fascinating, deep, and rich, and extraordinary history. It should really be recognized as not Muslim history, but in fact as part of our American history. We need to be taught these things also in our schools so that we understand the complexity and the plurality of this country.
Excellent. Is there anything else you'd like to share, or any guidance you'd like to give to our international education community, not only in the United States, but also abroad?
Sure, yeah. I think, so many of the problems that we have across the world are fundamentally premised on the permanence of borders, right? And I believe that there is a way in which education is the best way to traverse a border. So there's great promise and great opportunity with international education. But with that also comes the responsibility of making sure that you know what you're talking about. And with things, when we're talking about Muslim things, we're talking about so many other things than just a text. We're talking about so much context and history and region. So it's also incumbent that the educators make sure that they also educate themselves.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for coming to our conversation today, and it's always a pleasure to meet another Egyptian American.
Thank you,
so
Sharif.
much.
Nice to meet you.